I want to begin by talking about physical exercise. The first component of that cocktail, the first component of the wonder drug. What's happening today? Today, there is reduction of physical work. More and more people today have the quote-unquote luxury of not having to physically work hard. And I put it in quotes because it is one of the manifestations of the underprivilege of privilege. You see, in the past, we had to run after a deer for lunch or run away from a lion so that we don't become lunch. We had to gather berries for dessert. What do we do today? Go to the dessert table in our house or call up for pizza. In the past, we had to gather logs if we wanted to keep warm. Today, what do? This exercise. Turn up the thermometer. And we pay a price. But you know, when I was growing up in Israel, I remember, Israel is a Mediterranean country. 2 to 4 p.m. is siesta time. Very quiet. Kids are not out on the street. But at 4:00, sometimes even at 3:59, every day there was a shout from the street calling Tal, soccer, and then calling the other kids soccer or hide and seek or running around. That's what we did from 4 p.m. after siesta time until night when we went to sleep and Mom called us to have dinner. What happens today in Israel, and not just in Israel, around the world at 4 p.m.? It's not going down and playing soccer and running around. It's continuing to be on the computer. It's continuing to watch television. And as a result of that, as a result of the fact that we have become so much more sedentary, we are paying a very high price. Of course, on the physical level, but even more than that, on the psychological level. It is no coincidence the levels of depression have gone up tenfold. It is no coincidence since the 1960s. It is no coincidence that the average age, the onset of depression today is just under 15. Whereas in the 1960s, the average onset of depression was around 30. It is because we have stopped exercising. We've stopped exerting effort, energy. It is no coincidence the levels of ADD and ADHD are skyrocketing. Not to mention, and I will mention later, the physical consequences of a sedentary life. You see, exercise is not a luxury, it's a need. And it's a need just like oxygen is a need, just like certain vitamins are a need, just like protein and carbohydrates are needs. We weren't born to sit in front of a computer all day long or to just talk all day long. Yeah, we were meant to do it at the end of the day after we have hunted and gathered. And whether it's by God or whether it's by evolution or both, we now have a need for physical exercise, and we frustrate a need, whether it's a need for vitamins, whether it's a need for protein, or the need for exercise, we pay a price. Both physical price as well as psychological price. Seneca, over 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher, our forefathers lived every jot as well as we when they provided and dressed their own meat with their own hands, lodged upon the ground, and were not as yet come to the vanity of gold and gems. This is Seneca, a very thoughtful philosopher, talking about the lack of physical exercise that existed in his time. How much more is it today? When today we're living, in our age, the way that not even royalty lived just 100 or 200 years ago. The easy life, the luxurious life. And it's the underprivilege of privilege. We're paying the price for it. Let's see what our psychologist has to say about this. Ellen DeGeneres on the state of affairs.
We're lazy. We have buttons doing everything for it. There's no physical activity attached to anything anymore. Even the garage door opener. We used to have to get out of the car and open up the garage door. Now there's a button you push, you know? And the car window. This became too much. I don't want to churn butter. I just want fresh air. We still use that gesture if we want somebody to roll their window down in traffic. We still use that, even though nobody's got it. Because we'd look like idiots if we did this. We're lazy. We used to have breath mints. Now we have breath strips. They just dissolve on our tongue for us. How lazy. Can we not suck anymore? Put it on. I'm tired. I had a hard day.
Let me share with you a few studies about the effect of this kind of lifestyle. This was done by Michael Babiak and his colleagues at Duke Medical School. This was a very important study that launched after numerous studies that replicated this and showed how this applies, how exercise is important, not just for depression, also for other areas. So what Michael Babiak did was bring in 156 patients with major depression. These are people who have a number of symptoms, among which are insomnia, eating disorders, listlessness, lack of desire to act, depressed mood, many of them suicidal with attempts or thoughts about suicide, and on and on. These are people who are in very bad shape. And he brought them into the lab and randomly divided them into three groups. The first group was the exercise group. Second group was put on medication, and the third group was put on medication and exercise. The kind of medication was the antidepressant Zoloft, the second most popular common antidepressant after Prozac. Very powerful, works. A lot of studies compared to placebos showing that Zoloft works. An SSRI. The exercise that they were put on was 30 minutes of moderate difficulty, so aerobic physical exercise. So it could be jogging or brisk walking, it could be swimming. Not too hard, but moderate difficulty of exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And then he followed these three groups, exercise group, the medication group, and the exercise and medication group, followed them for 4 months. And here are the results. What he wanted to see is how many of the 156 patients, or 52 per group, how many of them get over their major depression. And what he found was that in each one of the three groups, over 60% got better. By the end of the 4 months, they were not experiencing the symptoms associated with major depression anymore, or most of the symptoms at the very least. They were could no longer be categorized by the DSM-4 as having major depression. There was no significant difference among the groups except for one difference. The group that exercised only, it took them a little bit longer to get over their major depression. So with the medication, it usually took probably around between 1 week and 2 weeks, around 10 days to overcome their depression for the 60% who were helped. For the exercise-only group, it took closer to a month. But after the first month, once they got better, there was no difference. all three groups benefited as much. Now, very important point. This does not mean that we should do away with antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills or Ritalin for ADD, ADHD. Not at all. What it is saying, though, is that we need to perhaps first ask whether exercise is or lack thereof is the underlying reason for the experience. Now, why should not we do away if the results are very similar between exercise and medication? Why shouldn't we do away with medication? Here is why. You see, let's say, let me just draw a circle. No. Let's say this is the total population of people who are depressed. We know that Zoloft or antidepressant medication helps about 60% of them. And we know that exercise also helps 60%. However, it is not the same 60%. There is an overlap by definition because it's more than 50%, but it doesn't help the same people. So there are people who are only helped by medication, there are people who are only helped by exercise, and there are people who are helped by both. So it's not saying let's do away with medication. It is important. It helps. However, it also says let's try exercise because I may be helped by exercise and not medication, or I may be helped by both. Here is the clincher, though, in this study. So what they were looking for, as they look in all these studies, is the relapse rates, meaning 6 months after the end of the study, when we no longer give medication, when we no longer push the participants to exercise 3 times a week at least. What happens after 6 months? And here is what they found. The relapse rates of the group on medication only. 38% out of the 60+% who got better returned back and had the major depression again. 38%, over a third. The group that did medication and exercise, relapse rates of 31%, just under a third of the 60+% who got better. Relapse rates of the exercise group only, and remember, they could continue to exercise or not. That was entirely up to them. The relapse rate of the exercise-only group, 9%. Remarkable results. Similar results earlier than the year 2000, all the way back in 1984 for dysthymia. Dysthymia is usually longer lasting, but less acute form of depression. So it's a deep feeling of sadness. Lasts for much longer than major depression. But also, exercise helps this. Now, when I first saw this study, and again, there are dozens, if not hundreds of studies by now, replicating this phenomenon on different areas, as I'll talk about in a minute, I said, wow, this is amazing. So, exercise is like taking an antidepressant. Seems like it. Exercise is like taking an antidepressant. But when I thought about further, I realized that that wasn't the case. It's not that exercising is like taking an antidepressant. It's rather that not exercising is like taking a depressant. This is more than just a semantic difference. This is more than just a semantic difference. Why? Because, you see, we weren't made to be sedentary. We weren't made to sit in front of the computer or in the classroom. We were made to run after that deer or run away from that lion. And when we frustrate a need, as we've talked about earlier, when we frustrate a need, we pay a price. So let's say our God-given or genes-given level of happiness, our base level of happiness is here. Our set point or set range is here. When we don't exercise, what we're doing is we're lowering that base level to here. If our normal level is here, what we're doing when we don't exercise, we're lowering it to here. And then, whereas we could have lived our life up here with the vicissitudes, and hopefully upward spiral, what we're doing was we're living our lives with the same ups and downs, only at a much lower level here. And we struggle just to get to our God-given or genes-given level of happiness. You know, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a therapist. However, if I were one, a prerequisite for me, for treating people, for working with people, would have been physical exercise. Or at the very least, being my number one priority of helping them to physically exercise. Because very often they would come because they don't have the motivation, perhaps, to exercise. But that would be my number one priority, either to make it a prerequisite for being treated or to make it the top priority. Why? Because I don't want to fight nature. I don't want to have to fight nature so that the person I'm working with gets to their God-given or genes-given level of well-being. I want to work with nature. Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. And one of the dictates of nature is that we need to be physically active. And I was just talking about this over dinner. I had dinner with Dave Fish, the tennis coach, and his wife, Bonnie Masland, who is a clinical therapist. And she told me, yeah, you know, she's been treating people for years. That's what I do. A prerequisite for treatment with me is physical exercise. So there are apparently psychologists who understand the importance of exercise. Why fight nature here when you can start when the base level can be here? Some other benefits, again, all based on research, and you read some of it in your readings, but more benefits to exercise. First, psychological benefits, self-esteem. On a few levels. First of all, bodily self-esteem. We feel better about ourselves. And also general self-esteem. We feel better about ourselves. State as well as trait self-esteem increases. In other words, as we feel right after we exercise, but also as we feel in the long term if we have a regular exercise regime. So both state as well as trait self-esteem is increased. Anxiety and stress. One of the things that are most susceptible to exercise. You know, Tommy can tell, my wife can tell if I haven't exercised for more than 48 hours. You know, I would come home and she would say, when did you last exercise? Why? Because she feels, you know, she has a sense of, you know, a little bit rougher around the edges, a little bit more tense. Again, as I mentioned in previous classes, I have an inclination for anxiety. And exercise, that's my drug. It's my wonder drug. At the very least, every other day. At the very least. It's been used very successfully for numerous clinical disorders, even schizophrenia, in conjunction with, not on its own, in conjunction with therapy and very often drugs. But it enhances the likelihood of success if you exercise as well. Also, ADD and ADHD. Not always enough, but very often enough. People who exercise and who exercise regularly, much more likely to get over ADD and ADHD. Why? Because there are numerous effects on our brain. Numerous effects on our brain. For example, the exact same chemicals that are released when we form new neural pathways, remember neurogenesis or neuroplasticity, the exact same chemicals that we need to form new neural pathways are created when we exercise. In other words, after we go for a run, this is the time when our brain is most susceptible to creating new neural pathways. So if you exercise in the morning, during the day, you retain much better the material that you have read or you have heard. You're much more creative after exercise than if you haven't exercised for a few days. And also, it helps us release these chemicals in the exact right amount. No more, no less than we need. Why? Because this is nature. knows best what we need. And we release these exact right amounts of chemicals that we're at our best. This is, by the way, why, again, as I mentioned earlier, religiously, I run before every lecture. Well, I don't always run. I like running outside, but it's not always possible, so I jump on my trampoline at home. I have, one of these small ones, and I jump on them, and I have my pulse meter on me. I shouldn't have told you this? No. Okay. And I can feel when I don't exercise before a lecture. For example, when I travel and arrive right before a lecture and don't have time to work out. I can feel when I read my retention rates, my concentration levels. Because as I said earlier, I have a mild case of ADHD. And again, exercise is my drug. Physical benefits. Again, I'm not saying anything that is new to you here, but here is the way to think about it. We all have a genes, God-given level of weight, of the right weight for us. Now, when we exercise, we're there, and that is healthy. That is where we should be. When we don't exercise, we're going above this weight, just like we go below our base level of well-being. In other words, what exercise does is simply bring us back to where we're supposed to be all along, which explains why most diets fail if not associated with physical exercise as well. Because our body will always fight to go back to the base level, to where we're supposed to be. And if we don't exercise, we'll struggle even harder. Chronic disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's heart disease, whether it's cancer. Once again, numbers are staggering, absolutely staggering. Diabetes, certain types of diabetes were only experienced by people 45 years and older. Today, kids in elementary school are getting these kinds of diabetes, and the association is mostly because of nutrition and lack of exercise. People who exercise are much less prone to these chronic diseases, reducing significantly the likelihood of diabetes, reducing by 50% or more the likelihood of heart failure and the likelihood of certain kinds of cancer. By over 50% reducing their likelihood. Again, a wonder drug. People who exercise regularly have a stronger immune system. Well, I have to prep you for this. And finally, if you haven't been convinced until now, hopefully this will convince you. Both men and women strengthens libido, their sexual desire. Enhances the likelihood of orgasms. People who exercise more regularly have more and better sex. And again, a lot of research showing this, and this, by the way, applies to all ages. To all ages. Well, not all ages. I hope. Yeah. 21 and on. No. Now, the important thing to remember about exercise, it is not a panacea. It's not a fix-all. Remember, not everyone benefits from exercise. There are some people for whom medication is absolutely the right thing, and it's important. However, in many situations, and it's evident by the literature, by the research, in most situations, exercise can help, even if it's not on its own. Even in conjunction with something else, it helps. And again, why fight nature? Why fight it? Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. What's very important is recovery. Let me read you something that Dinsburg and Zillig write about in the Handbook of Positive Psychology, two researchers in the field. Repeated workouts that are too intense to allow complete recovery may cause endurance athletes to experience staleness, a syndrome that is characterized by increased psychological symptoms of anxiety with increased sympathetic nervous system, catecholamine, and cortisol base levels. Now, what they're saying here is that there can be too much of a good thing. And this is especially important for perfectionists to understand. It doesn't mean that more is always better when it comes to exercise. There is too much. And some of the symptoms of overtraining are very similar to the symptoms of undertraining. Higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of staleness, lack of motivation, as well as ultimately could lead to depression. I mean, this is a symptom of perfectionism. This is something that I experienced when I was an athlete. Overtraining, not recovering enough, and paying the price. Physically, of course, with injuries, but also psychologically. What I recommend is between 1 to 4 days of rest a week. Ideally, you want to exercise 5 or 6 times a week. At minimum, I would say every other day. So it would be either 3 or 4 days a week. At minimum, every other day. Ideally, you may want a little bit more than that. Each time, about 30 minutes, could go all the way up to an hour. The key here is to listen to your body. If your body is hurting beyond the slight discomfort of exercise, which is natural, stop. If a muscle hurts, stop. Err on the side of too little rather than too much. Also, one of the ways to listen to your body, if you're not as sensitive to it, is putting on a heart rate monitor, which is something not very expensive, very useful, very helpful. So I know that my exercise would be around 70% of maximum heart rate. 70% of maximum heart rate for me is about 120, 128. So I exercise at around, between 120 and 135. And then once in a while, I also introduce interval training, where I go all the way up to 9%, which is about 165 heart rate for me. But very easy to find out about, what your heart rate is. Usually, maximum heart rate is around 220 minus your age. So if you're 20, your maximum is 200. Mine being 37, it's 183. Again, more or less. And then you want to be at around 70% of it. 65% to 75% of it for moderate, effective benefits of exercise. And to keep in mind that quantity does affect quality. And once again, we have the graph that we see so often, the curvilinear relationship. So if on this side of the graph we had psychological plus physiological benefits, and here we have effort or amount of work, the graph looks like this. Where too little effort is not good, we're compromising on our base level of happiness. Too much effort is also not good. That's when we experience the staleness or the anxiety. And what we want to get to is more or less around our optimum level. And also optimum level given how much time we have. Yeah, in an ideal world, I would work out 6 times a week for 1 hour each time. In an ideal world. But I want to do many other things. So I exercise at least 4 times a week, 30 minutes each time. It's good enough for me. Identify what's good enough for you. Recovery is important. We talked about recovery on the psychological level. Recovery is very important in sports. Let me share with you just a quick story about Derek Clayton. Derek Clayton was a runner in the early 60s, one of the best long-distance runners in the world. One of the best, not the best. He ran marathons. And the reason why he wasn't the best, many people said, well, because physically he wasn't that fit or suitable for marathons. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, 1 meter 88. His VO2 max, his maximum oxygen capacity was not that high as the top runners in the world. But what he had going for him was that he was the hardest worker on the circuit. He would run in excess of 100 miles a week, way over 100 miles a week. Worked very hard. Sorry, I wrote it down. Yeah, way over 100 miles each week. And he became one of the best runners in the world, but never got to being at the very best. And then what happened? Because of his hard work, overexertion, he got injured quite seriously and couldn't run for a whole month as he was training for one of the most important marathons, and this marathon was in Japan. So for a whole month, couldn't train, hardly walked. About a week before he started just very lightly jogging, and he said he'll run in Japan. He was invited there as one of the best runners in the world. He said he'll use it as a training run, as part of his training regime for the next marathon. So he comes to this marathon having not trained for over a month, breaks his personal best record by 8 minutes, and becomes the first person in history to run a marathon in under 2 hours and 10 minutes, running it in 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 36 seconds. 1967. Continues to train hard. 2 years later, overtrains again, gets injured again. And once again, for over a month, he can't run at all. And then enters the Belgian marathon. Breaks his own personal best, breaks the world record, 2 minutes, 2 hours, 8 minutes, and 33 seconds, a world record or world best that holds for 12 years. This is when trainers and athletes began to understand the importance of tapering, the importance of taking time off, the importance of recovery. There can be too much of a good thing. Very similar story. Joanne Benoit ended up winning the 1984 Los Angeles Marathon after having been injured and was forced to take time off. The Danish soccer team, another example, I think it was 1991, ended up winning the European Championship after being out of the competition and being brought in the last minute because Yugoslavia was just breaking apart at the time. So they came in as a replacement for Yugoslavia, literally taking the Danish team after it was eliminated from the prelims, bringing them from the beach to play in the tournament. But they had recovered, they were fresh, they were ready to go. Recovery is important in sports, it's important on the psychological level. Okay, so exercise is good. It's the wonder drug, the first part of the cocktail. I would argue, well, one of the most important ones. And yet, most people, not at Harvard necessarily, but most people around the world don't exercise. What are some of the barriers that we need to overcome in order to introduce exercise regularly into our lives? First, it is painful. It's not comfortable to exercise at, say, 70% of our maximum heart rate. Doesn't hurt that much, but it's more comfortable to sit in front of the television or play Nintendo. So what do? The first thing that we can do is divide and conquer. One of the things that especially perfectionists do is say, okay, so I'm going to start exercising. And to be fit, I need to do 6 miles a day, and that's what I'm going to start running, 6 miles a day. And of course, what happens very quickly? The next day, you get up and you're hurt, but you're a perfectionist, you're tough, no pain, no gain, and you go out for a run again. And what happens? You hurt even more the next day, but you push through the pain. And after a few weeks, you get injured. But even if you don't get injured, the schema that is created in your mind about exercise is the following. It is exercise equals pain. Now, our mind does not like pain, and it tries to avoid pain. So let's say you go on a holiday and you stop your exercise regime. You stop your exercise regime for a week or 2 weeks, and then you come back. It becomes exceedingly difficult to go back to exercising. Why? Because your mind subconscious mind says, I don't want to experience this again. And then it prevents you, it paralyzes you. This is very often the procrastination that comes through because we don't want to experience that pain. A much healthier approach is to say, okay, so I'll start with walking for a mile, for 10 minutes or 20 minutes walk. Do it for a week or 2 weeks and then build it up gradually. And again, err on the side of doing too little rather than too much. Because then, exercise, if I've built it up gradually, is not about pain. Over time, it even becomes sort of addictive in the positive sense of the word, that we want to do it, that we long for it. So doing it gradually. Also, use distractors. When I jump on my trampoline, when I run outside, I have no problem. But when I jump on my trampoline, I have to have distractors. It is so boring for me. Again, some people can be on the bike for an hour, and they're fine. For them, it's meditation, and that's great. But many people need distractors, whether it's music, whether it's TV, whether it's my kids running around, but having something that keeps us going. Social support. The number one predictor of exercise success for the long term is, do I do it with other people? Do I have the social support to do it? And once again, this is not right for everyone. There are certain people for whom the right thing is to do it by themselves. This is the time, especially introverts, where they enjoy just being on their own. Just closing their eyes, listening to their music, or listening to their heart rate, or whatever it is, heart beating. But they want time by themselves, and that's fine. But for most people, social support helps. Here is a study. This is done by Wing and Jerry, two psychologists. What they did was introduce individuals to a 4-month program that included behavioral change, that included diet change, and that included exercise change for 4 months. The two conditions were either with social support, doing it with your friend and a family member, or without social support. Those without social support, who did it by themselves, 76% completed the 4-month program, and 24% were still doing it 6 months later. So 76% did it during the 4 months, 24% only, less than a quarter, did it 6 months later. Kept up with the behavioral, exercise, as well as diet change. The group that had the social support, 95% completed the 4 months, 95 as opposed to the 76%, and 67% continued with the regime once the study was over for 6 months later. So it enhanced the likelihood of success a great deal. Let me show you one last example of social support. Okay, so this is not exactly what I mean, but social support helps. So start, if you haven't started, start today. I'll see you on Thursday. Hi, good morning. We're going to pick up where we left off last time, but before we do, a few of you came to me after class and asked about alternative forms of exercise. So the study that I gave, also what you read, the article by Callahan and others, is mostly about aerobic exercise. And as I mentioned earlier, this is about moderate intensity workout, which would mean, if you want to work with pulse, about 70%, between 65 and 75% of your maximum heart rate. Again, you just Google heart rate, exercise, and you'll immediately get all the tables that you need. But that's one form of exercise. Some of you ask, what about weight training? What about interval training? So sprints and stops, something that, the crew team does often, athletes do often. What about this form? The reason why I didn't bring it up explicitly in the lecture is because the jury is still out on the different forms of exercise. But let me tell you what are some of the trends that we see in research. Right now, it seems that if there is only one form of exercise that you do, the best bang for the buck, best value for your time would be aerobic exercise. 3, ideally 4 times 30 minutes of aerobic exercise a week. That's at minimum. However, if you can also do weight training and supplement the aerobic exercise, that's terrific, that's great. Twice a week, 3 times a week of weight training is great, especially as you get older. That weight training contributes more. But also at a very young age, weight training is good. However, it is not a replacement for aerobic exercise. It hasn't shown to have the same psychological effects as aerobic exercise does. The other form of exercise that has been studied, and again, these are all tentative results. There have been pilot studies about it. The sample sizes are not large enough yet to say definitively, just like we can say about aerobic exercise, it has a similar effect to some of our most powerful psychiatric drugs. That's definitive. There are tons of studies on it ever since Babiak 2000 as well as before. But another form of exercise that has begun to be studied with some very promising results is interval training. Interval training would be, say, running at between 90 and 95% of your maximum heart rate. So if you're 20 and your maximum heart rate would be 200, because it's 220 minus your age, then it would be running at around 180 to 190 pulse rate, which is hard, which is tough, which you can't do for a very long time. But doing it for as little as 30 seconds up to a minute, and then resting, letting your heart rate go back down to 60% of its maximum, say 120, and then doing another interval, that has been shown with pilot studies only to have remarkable effects. In fact, often more powerful than aerobic exercise on its own, and lasts for even longer, the effect. So, again, I did not introduce it officially as part of the class, but since many of you asked, I'm introducing it because what I want to introduce here are only things that are with very robust results. John Ratey talks about this, and I'll talk a little bit about John Ratey in a minute. He's the Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who's probably the leading proponent and researcher in the area of exercise and mental health. And he himself, even though the results are still tentative, he introduces 2 interval trainings a week. So in addition to working out 6 days a week, 2 of them include full-out sprinting, rest. Full-out sprinting, rest. And what they've shown is that with even less time than 30 minutes, you can get the same psychological effect and even better. What I do twice a week, I introduce interval training. So for example, this morning when I was on my trampoline, I did it for 30 minutes, and out of the 30 minutes, there were 4 sprints. Indeed. You don't believe me that I do trampoline, do you? I'll videotape it. Maybe not. So 4 sessions of sprints, and then I have my heart monitor on, going all the way, for me, it's about 165 heart rate, between 165 and 170. And then resting, going back to about 110, which is more or less 60% of my maximum, and then doing it 4 times. And for the rest of the 30 minutes, I just do moderate aerobic exercise. So I also introduce the interval training. The weight training I do less of because I get that from yoga, a lot of the strengthening exercises. The most important thing, though, that I do want to say about interval training is that, especially for perfectionists, it's very easy to overtrain. You don't want to get to your maximum heart rate and keep it there for a long time, even if you can. More does not necessarily mean better. Again, unless you're training for the Olympics, in which case you do want to get to 100% of your maximum heart rate at times. For maximum health, you want to get to 90%, maximum 95% of your max heart rate, which is why a heart rate monitor can help so much, because it can tell you when you're working too hard or when it's too easy. Bottom line, variety is good for exercise. If you can introduce dancing, that's great exercise. If you can introduce once in a while working out in the gym, once in a while playing basketball, rowing, the more variety, the better. But the foundation, at least 3, ideally 4 times a week, 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. So we stopped last time with overcoming barriers. And some of the barriers are that it's difficult, there is some pain associated with it, even if you are at 70% of your heart rate. It's still uncomfortable. And ways to deal with it is, at least until you get into it, because very often we enter the zone when we start to run and we don't feel the difficulty anymore. But at least at the beginning, it's important to have social support, to divide and conquer, to build gradually, and to have distractors such as TV, your MP3 or whatever it is. Another barrier, and this one is unfortunately very common here on campus, is that we just don't have time. In high school, I give a lot of talks in high schools, and one of the things that I see there is that students generally, in many high schools, actually have to be part of a team. They have to, in addition to doing physical exercise, PE, they also have to be part of a team. So they get not enough, but more exercise. Whereas one of the first things that go in college, especially or only for students who do not play on the team, one of the first things that go is exercise. I don't have time. I have so many things I want to do. It's a new world. Well, it's also the first thing that goes during exam period because I'm so stressed and I have so many things to do. Well, it should be the last thing to go. It should be the last thing to go. Why? Because it is an investment. You may be losing the 45 minutes, working out for 30 minutes and showering after, which I recommend. You may lose that 45 minutes, but you'll gain so much more. It's such a good investment. Why? Because your memory actually gets better when you exercise. So you get more bang for the buck in terms of time you study. Your creativity levels go up. Your concentration, whether you have ADD or not, especially if you have a tendency toward ADD or ADHD. But even for people without it, concentration goes up significantly. Energy levels go up significantly. So it's a very good investment. Remember I told you the story when I stopped exercising at the end of the squash season. And suddenly I said, I have so much time. And I ended up getting so much less done. A, because I didn't have the rituals. And B, because I wasn't as focused, I wasn't as creative, I wasn't as energized. It should be the last thing to go, especially during stressful periods, such as exam period. One way to overcome the time commitment, again, is not to rely on self-discipline. We've established that before we saw the research, we have a limited amount of self-discipline. Create rituals where, say, 3 mornings during the week you'll do it, or if a good time for you is the afternoon or evening, but have a ritual around it. Another barrier to exercising regularly, and this is an interesting one, and often overlooked, but extremely powerful, and that is the subconscious barrier. Nathaniel Branden talks about this, and I talk about it a little bit in my book, quoting him. He talks about self-esteem, and part of self-esteem is the notion that we are worthy of happiness, the notion of being worthy of happiness. And when you ask people, are you worthy of happiness, most people will say yes. But if you ask the subconscious, very often for many people, it's no. Whether it's because of the voices that we heard in the past, from teachers, educators, parents, significant adults, society at large, by comparing us to unrealistic models. But very often we have this voice, the subconscious level, that we're not really worthy of happiness. And that is a barrier that stops us from becoming happier. Now, one of the things that we know with exercise is that it's one of the, if not the most powerful drug for making us happier. Now, I know that exercise makes me happier, it makes me feel good, but if my subconscious thinks that I'm unworthy of these feelings, unworthy of being happy, it may, in fact, stop me from exercising. Why? Because remember, the mind doesn't like when there is an inconsistency between what's inside and what's outside. And if what's inside is saying, shouldn't be happy, then I try to match it with what's inside. And then I don't exercise. Because if I do exercise, then there will be a disconnect. I will be happier than I think I'm worthy of. There's a lot of research on this. For example, by a psychologist by the name of Swan, who talks about self-confirmation theory, which is a very powerful force within us. There is a self-enhancement that we want to appear good in other people's eyes, in our eyes, but there is a counter force, which is self-confirmation, where we want to confirm whatever we think about ourselves. And if we think not worthy of happiness, we'll very often not do things that actually will make us happy. We see it in other areas, in relationships, for example. If I think I'm unworthy of a wonderful partner, of being happy in a relationship, very often I will inadvertently, working here, jeopardize the relationship and look for things that are not working. Actively, subconsciously, look for ways of hurting the relationship. So we need to be aware of the subconscious level, and it very much applies to whether or not we exercise. So what do we do with this? The best thing to do is to just do it. Again, ritualize it, not analyze it too much. Just go ahead and exercise. 3-4 times a week is good for you, just do it. And again, it's the 5-minute takeoff. The subconscious mind will try and tell you, don't do it, you don't have time, there are other things, you'll do it tomorrow. Next week you'll start the regime. The subconscious mind is very smart in its attempt and will do anything that it can almost to create this congruency. And when you go out and exercise and you show yourself, yes, I am worthy of happiness, very often the subconscious mind will follow suit. So just do it. The second thing is recognize, this is on the cognitive level, recognize how important physical exercise is. Remember what Marty Seligman said. We mostly focus on neck up, and we do it as psychologists, we do it as students in an academic institution, especially in a place like this. So much is about thinking and cognition. That's how you got here. That's how you were successful. But it's no less important to think about neck down. In fact, the mind alone can only take us so far when it comes to happiness, which is why I told you if I were a therapist, a prerequisite for me to treat people would be to have them exercise regularly, because I don't want to fight nature. I want to work with nature and build on it. Exercise, in many ways, is the unsung hero of psychological interventions. It helps on so many levels. John Ratey, mentioned him, Harvard Medical School professor, psychiatrist. In a way, exercise can be thought of as psychiatrist's dream treatment. It works on anxiety, on panic disorder, and on stress in general, which has a lot to do with depression. And it generates the release of neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, that are very similar to our most important psychiatric medicines. Having a bout of exercise is like taking a little bit of Prozac and a little bit of Ritalin right where it is supposed to go. The exact right amount of it, the exact right location, and without side effects or with side effects, positive side effects, physical as well as mental and emotional side effects. What John Ratey is calling for in his wonderful, wonderful book, just came out recently in this January, what he calls for is an exercise revolution. And he backs up this call with a lot of scientific evidence. of why it is so important. Let me share with you just one area that he talks about. He talks about all ages. He talks about kids, adults, as well as the elderly population. And it has positive effects for every age, from 0 to 120. Let me talk about a couple of studies and findings that were where exercise was implemented in schools. So there are a few schools that introduced physical exercise as an integral part of its curriculum. For example, and this has been replicated in a few schools, every morning 45 minutes of some form of exercise. Usually running, sometimes rowing, cycling, climbing. There's a school that in New Jersey that actually put a climbing wall where students exercised. But some form of aerobic exercise, sometimes intertwined with interval training, every morning before school, 45 minutes a day. Some of the schools had it later during the day, most of them in the morning. Here are some of the results from some of these schools that actually introduced it. Obesity levels, not surprising, went down. For example, in Naperville in Illinois, in the district there where physical exercise was introduced in school, which is, by the way, interesting because in most schools, just yesterday I gave a talk at Horace Mann, and the teachers told me that in many of the schools in New York, physical exercise is being taken out rather than more of it is introduced. Physical exercise and art, both taken out. Why? Because they have to get the grades. Neck up. And that's a pity, and they pay a price. So obesity in the school in Naperville, or in the district Naperville in Illinois, obesity levels went down from 30% to 3% among the students. That has repercussions not just for the students' lives there, that they're more comfortable, that they're happier. It has repercussions and consequences for the rest of their lives. They're much less susceptible and prone to the chronic illnesses, such as cancer, heart failure. It's a win-win on so many levels, much less susceptible to diabetics. So that's obesity. What they also find at Naperville is that the grades went up significantly. In fact, usually the U.S. doesn't do very well when it comes to those international tests, math and science tests that they do. I think it's usually in 8th grade. Well, Naperville is an exception. They scored number 6 in the world in mathematics and number 1 in the world in science. Now, people argue, well, Naperville is an affluent neighborhood or district, and it's true. How about other places? Well, they introduced exercise in very poor areas, in inner cities. For example, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, where many people are way below, where the average is way below the average income for the state. When before they introduced exercise, school performance, they were significantly below state average, Pennsylvania's average. After introducing exercise within a year, they went up to 17% above state average. With the only change being that year, introducing physical exercise. They've seen this in other schools, in other districts as well. And what they also saw in the same school, in Titusville, that fist fights, for example, they noticed violence disappeared completely as a result of the exercise. What they found also in a school in Iowa, where they introduced physical exercise, disciplinary problems went down from 225 to 95 in 1 year. In another school in Kansas, also inner city, disciplinary problems went down by 67% after they introduced exercise. We're much less likely to be violent. It calms us. It brings us to our natural state of being, which is much calmer as opposed to being angry and upset And people need to let out that steam. And unfortunately, very often that steam is let out in fights with aggression. And this is a much healthier way to divert that healthy energy. Let me show you a clip from one of my favorite movies, Legally Blonde. And it's the part where a woman is just being charged with the murder of her husband. And our very own law school graduate, Reese Witherspoon, defends her. Whoops. Let me get to it. Thank you. Videos. Legally, here it is.
We're defending Brooke Wyndham, whose very wealthy husband was found shot to death in their Beacon Hill mansion.
Gold digger?
You'd think so, since the stiff was 60, but she was rich on her own, some kind of fitness empire. You can buy her exercise tapes on infomercials.
Wait, are you talking about Brooke Taylor?
Maiden name Taylor. You know her?
She's at Delta Nu. She wasn't in my pledge class, but she graduated 4 years before me. But I used to take her class at the Los Angeles Sports Club. She's amazing.
Amazing? How?
She can make you lose like 3 pounds in one class. She's completely gifted.
Well, in all likelihood, she's completely guilty as well.
I just don't think Brooke could have done this. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. They just don't.
There you go. Sorry. You know, in the book, I talk about the happiness revolution. And I think, based on a lot of research, that the foundation for a happiness revolution has to come with an exercise revolution. Why? Because if we don't exercise, we're fighting against nature. So the foundation, the basis of a happiness revolution has to start neck down through the body.